and welcome to the opening panel of the 2025 Religion and Ecology Summit. My name is Reverend Sam Harrelson, and I am a doctoral student in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And it is an honor to be with you today, moderating this extraordinary gathering of scholars, artists, and faith leaders who each in their own way help us trace the sacred currents of water through story, ritual, ethics, and studies. This year's summit calls us to consider the theme Sacred Waters of the World, Pathways to Ecological Reverence, Renewal, and Responsibility on a Changing Planet. Those three words, reverence, renewal, responsibility, have profound implications within the streams of thought and practice we'll hear from our panelists today. Water, as we know, is not merely a material substance, but a being that invites us into relationship, into care, into memory, and ultimately into justice. In my own work here with ecological intentionality and spiritual ecology, I've been shaped by thinkers like Thomas Berry and Edith Stein and Alfred North Whitehead, voices that remind us that consciousness is not confined to the human and that water is not passive. It reveals, it teaches, it connects, it cleanses, it baptizes, and it dismantles. And perhaps most critically in our own current moment, water remembers. Each of our panelists brings a unique perspective to this conversation, whether from Riverine readings of scripture, Jewish ecological ethics, Balinese water temples, ancestral waters of the Po Valley, or interdisciplinary laboratories of sacred design. Together, I think they'll help us reflect on what it means for water to not only be a symbol, but an actor, a participant in the spiritual and ecological renewal that we so desperately need. As we begin, I invite you to consider this throughout each of our panelists' discussions. What does water know that we've forgotten? And what might it be asking of us in return? I'll introduce each panelist before their presentations. Additionally, I'll try to make sure that we have a good 15 or so minutes, at least at the end of the presentations, for question and answers, as well as any clarifications. So as questions arise, I invite you, and I hope that you'll make note of them. And we'll create space at the end, after everyone has presented, for those questions. So let's begin our journey with the Reverend Dr. Brian Fu Kolia, whose work reimagines Naaman's cleansing in 2 Kings 5 as a site of both Riverine power and post-colonial critique.
Thank you, Reverend Sam, for that introduction. Before I begin this presentation, I want to acknowledge that I am presenting from the waters of the Moana, where we are at the front line of the climate catastrophe. There are many islands, there are many identities within the Moana, and I don't speak on behalf of all of them, but I do want to say that I speak out of respect for them in terms of what we are experiencing here in the Moana. So I acknowledge all our elders and all the people, the tangata o le Moana here from where I zoom from. So I just want to talk about a different type of water as opposed to the waters of the Moana, and offer a reading, a rereading of this text, 2 Kings 5, with the story of Naaman's healing. And I read from a perspective of a Riverine villager, where our village, my home village, the center is this big river that flows right through the middle. So the story of Naaman's healing in 2 Kings 5 introduces an interesting contrast. Despite there being wonderful and pristine waters in Syria, Elisha forces Naaman to make the trek to the River Jordan, who frustratingly does so. Perhaps the Jordan is not as immaculate as the Abana and Fapa of Damascus, but the point is that it is not so much the source of water that is important, but obedience to the prophet's instruction. As a descendant of a Riverine village here in Sili, I share the frustration of Naaman, who is irritated that he could have gone to a river in his own land. People who live by the river often take pride in their rivers. with high esteem for its drinking and healing benefits. For this presentation, or here in Pacifico we call Talanoa, I want to take a riverbank perspective to reread the healing of Naaman in 2 Kings 5. Naaman's rage is particularly intriguing because while common readings speak to his arrogance, I feel there is an element of trying to silence or trying to gag or trying to muzzle the native. Specifically, Naaman's servants are silencing Naaman's right to question and be frustrated at Elisha's instructions to wash in the Jordan River. For centuries, native voices have been silenced by colonial forces, and as the Bible is a tool of the colonial project, native voices in the text have been kept quiet also. Naaman is not particularly silent in the text. However, he is silenced by his servants who, in advising him to follow the Israelite prophet, seem to be silencing his nativeness. This warrants a talanoa, which seeks to uplift the native voice in the text, particularly that of the native Syrian Naaman, in talanoa with the ecological spaces native to native bodies. This talanoa also interrogates Naaman's healing by tala, or extending further into the noa, the void, to explore the colonial tendencies in how native bodies may be foregoing their own cultural and native healing customs in favor of other practices. The village of Sili in Savai'i is a riverine village where its livelihood is centered around its river. The people of Sili pride themselves on the natural resources provided by the river, as the river water is utilized for drinking, irrigation of crops, as well as offering a rich supply of freshwater prawns and eels, which are consumed freely by its villagers. Such is the fecundity of Sili's natural landscape that it has been recognized as the first village in the Pacific to be organically certified. The river has enormous value as noted through its conservation efforts. The Sili River had been targeted heavily by the Samoan governments of the past and present as a source for hydropower. While the project may see the potential reduction of fossil fuels by Samoa's electrical company, EPC, Electrical Power Corporation, the conceivable depletion of its natural resources and other environmental threats, such as land degradation and water contamination, would nevertheless far outweigh the benefits of building such a hydropower plant. As a result, the natives of the village of Sili, led by the activism of local Sili environmentalists, Fiu Elisara Mataise and Reverend Fiu Kolia, vehemently rejected the government proposal, choosing instead to maintain use and ownership of the river. Keeping ownership also ensured that the Sili River would not only provide water and resources for its own villagers, but also neighboring villages. Sili Village initiated the Paloli Falefaa water reticulation project, from which the Sili River contributes pristine, fresh water to 5 neighboring villages. Water is seen as a public good that should be delivered free to all homes. Attempts by some to privatize water in Samoa were contrary to the principle of public goods. The project's success has fortified villagers' rejection of user pays and privatization. Economically, the river is the livelihood of the people of Sili, and as the villagers have claimed, as long as they have the river, they do not have to succumb to the capitalist system. In other words, they could live without money. Yet, aside from the obvious environmental and capitalist reasons behind declining the government's hydropower project, there were also spiritual and sentimental reasons that are significant for natives. The villagers truly believe that the river is a blessing from God, as evident in the provision of its natural resources. This feeds into the natives' view that water should be shared freely, not only among themselves, but also to neighboring villages and the rest of the island of Savai'i, and should not have to be paid for. Also, the river represents Sili's heritage, as many of its traditional tales are associated with the river waters. One significant story that is well known to natives of Sili tells of a woman by the name of Lauta from Whanga, another Savaian village, who wanted to marry the legendary demigod of Sili, Taimon Tawai. Taimon Tawai was revered by the natives of Sili as the protector of the inland village and its rivers. Embarking on her journey, Leauta was accompanied by her blind father, Leai Faleava, and Aitu, spirit, Vave, who manifested as a bird, a manuali. As they reached the district of Balauli, where Sili is located, Vave settled there as it was his home, while Leauta and her blind father continued until they reached the riverine home of Diamantavai. Leaifaleava and Leauta wanted to rest, where one of their chief orators, Fiu, was residing in a house where the roof was weaved using sinnet. Fiu welcomed the two into his home, requesting the purpose of their trip. When told of the nature of their journey, they were directed to a path through the river that would lead them inland to where Taimantavae was residing. As they were heading along the path, Leaifaleava asked Leauta to see if his staff was on a rock, but Leauta replied that the staff was actually well above Sili, the rock. This gave the village its name Sili. There they were greeted by a talking wild hibiscus tree, known as the Whaungangana, who gave the two final directions on how to locate Diamantavai. The Whaungangana told them that when they get further upstream, they will find a rock known as the Whaanuanua. They were advised that when they come up to this rock, they were to break off a branch from the Fisoa tree, as you can see in that picture, and strike the rock, which would result in heavy rain that would cause the river to rise. This would force Diamantavai to hop onto his boat and paddle downstream, where they would eventually cross paths. After doing this, Diamantavai, who was bathing in the river but was not visible except for his hair, decided to paddle on his boat downstream when the water elevated. The Whaungangana had earlier told the two to tie the demigod's hair tightly to the riverbank trees in case Diamantavai would return at the sight of the two. This they did, which led to their long-awaited encounter. Diamantavai, after meeting Leauta, eventually married her. Through this tale, the people of Sili can trace their roots back to Diamantavai, who was also the village's main ancestor, back to the water that he guarded with his long hair, and back to the land that brought forth the talking Whaungangana. Indeed, the sense of pride and euphoria that the Sili natives have of their sacred river waters prompts attitudes of skepticism and defiance. As Clooney and La'avasa McPherson rightfully argue, this resistance does not stem from reluctance by Sili to share its water. It supplies water to adjacent villages through the Palauli-le-Falefa water scheme. Its resistance is to supplying water for which the government would then charge others. This experience provides us with an alternative or an alternative sense of Naaman's own resistance to foreign waters. Common readings of this narrative seem to depict Naaman as a crazy, complaining male army commander. Yet, there is one particular characteristic of Naaman's identity that has been put to the side by such readings in order to promote his depiction as a crazy man: that he is Aramaean, a native of Syria. Indeed, Naaman's nativeness is imperceptible in the story due firstly to the efforts of the narrator. The narrator has decided to focus first on Naaman being a general of the Aramean army and second as a leper. In other words, he is depicted as a foreigner relative to Israel and also a sick person. Both these descriptions thus associate Naaman's character with someone in the purview of Israelite religion as unclean. From a social point of view, Walter Brueggemann states that leprosy was a deeply feared skin disease in the ancient world. It is important to remember that the ancient world had no access to any of our medicines, and therefore an epidemic of a deeply contagious disease was a great threat. The primary strategy for coping with the infected was isolation and exclusion, thus cutting off the infected from normal social intercourse and certainly from participation in worship activities. Thus, the threat is social as well as physical. In light of Sili's experience with the Samoan government interests in its river, we may consider the narrator's silencing of Naaman as being similar to the efforts of the Samoan government. As the narrator subtly silences Naaman's nativeness, so the Samoan government also is guilty of silencing Sili's nativeness, pushing the narrative towards a consideration of the needs of the rest of the Savaii Island. Such an agenda may seem noble, but at the same time it disregards the sentiments of the native custodians of the Sili waters. The hydropower project threatened to encroach on the native rights of the Sili people through its intentions to commodify the water and thus take away native ownership. The other party responsible for silencing Naaman is Naaman's own servants. Rather than supporting and sharing in Naaman's anger, they instead oppose his wrath by promoting the prophet Elisha's orders. When read alongside the experience of Sili's natives, the silencing of Naaman becomes even more unsettling. Not much is known about the identity of the servants, yet we could imagine them to be also natives of Syria. After all, Brueggemann identifies them as aides, while Marvin Sweeney acknowledges them as soldiers. If they are perceived as aides or soldiers, then it may be fair to assume that they too are Syrian natives. If this is the case, then we may see here a conflict of attitudes between native voices regarding natural resources. Thus, it is possible to perceive a deflated Naaman being let down by his fellow natives who do not share the same pride in the Syrian rivers. One can think of the case of Sili. As a Sili native, it must be mentioned that in spite of the rejection of the Samoan government's plans for a hydropower operation, there were still voices of other natives who threatened to derail Sili's objection. These natives were more interested in the monetary compensation for villagers had the hydropower project gone ahead. Perhaps we could envisage the servants, aides, soldiers to reflect the attitudes of the natives who had not held the same regard for their river waters as the natives who chose to repudiate the Samoan government's push to commodify the river. For this talk, or as we say in Pacifica Talanoa, let us de-silence Naaman by liberating and illuminating native and indigenous voices. Firstly, I want to revisit Naaman's claims of nativeness. In 2 Kings 5 verse 12, he says, "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" The question may seem rhetorical, but as Paul Ellingsworth rightfully argues about Naaman's question, he is proved wrong, but that is not the point. So what is the point of Naaman's query? We never get to hear any further commentary about the Syrian rivers. The next words to come out of Naaman's mouth, in fact, are words of praise for Israel's God in verse 15. So we do not hear any more of Naaman's rage either. What takes place is a physical transformation as his Jordan-washed body is likened to a young boy. But there is also another transformation that takes place, one which is tragic from a native point of view. Such a change is enabled by a shift in the power dynamics, for Syria is evidently the colonial power in the narrative. Yet in this reading, the Israelite prophet seems to embody the role of the colonizer. As we see with Naaman, the native pride has disappeared as the native becomes proselytized. In narrative terms familiar to Pacifica peoples, the noble savage has been tamed and civilized according to the colonizer's ways. In other words, Naaman undergoes a religious, social, and anthropological change. Naaman's servants, aides, soldiers' points of reason is the trivial nature of his wrath, that is, over the simple request to clean himself in the Jordan. But what I sense here is a case of gaslighting. Gaslighting is the attempt to manipulate another person's psychological state by making that person believe in their craziness. I charge Naaman's servants guilty of gaslighting Naaman. In their silencing of Naaman, they gaslight him into questioning the sanity of his rage. By doing this, Naaman, and we, the readers, are led to ignore the bigger concern, that of native concern. The Abana and Pharpar are clearly apt for cleansing, as Naaman has claimed, and as a Riverine native, Naaman's outburst should be justified. Yet, while the servants may be guilty of gaslighting, it should be noted that gaslighting also involves the creation of an alternative narrative, one which makes the gaslighter superior over the other. Although Naaman's fury does involve an arrogant claim to his own superiority, his arrogance is shut down by the gaslighting, but more specifically, the creation of a different narrative. Allow me to elaborate. I have defined gaslighting in its more basic form. However, there are different types of gaslighting, and here I bring to Talanoa what is known as racial gaslighting. Angelique M. Davis and Rose Ernst define racial gaslighting as the political, social, economic, and cultural process that perpetuates and normalizes a white supremacist reality through pathologizing those who resist. Just as racial formation rests on the creation of racial projects, racial gaslighting as a process relies on the production of a particular narrative. These narratives are called racial spectacles. Racial spectacles are narratives that obfuscate the existence of a white supremacist state power structure. End quote. In terms of the biblical narrative, we see a racial spectacle through the Israelite narrative. As mentioned before, I'm quite aware that the Syrians are the colonial powers in the narrative. But as a Pacifica reader, I must also question the colonial and power dynamic. When considering the racial spectacle, the supremacist reality is that the Israelite God is superior to all others, which then translates into Israelite waters being supreme. As a result, the Syrian waters for Naaman become inferior, and the native Naaman thus believes this narrative as he eventually dips into the Jordan River. In this case, the colonized take the place of the colonizers by not only ordering the Syrian native to take a bath in the foreign river, but by flipping the narrative of cultural and religious superiority. Indeed, it may be that when Naaman is silenced after initially voicing his skepticism and frustration, he had believed in the racial spectacle that sought to belittle his own native narrative. Let us tell no further. As scholars have noted, the real substance of Naaman's healing was not so much the washing, but the obedience. Understanding this element of Naaman's healing highlights the colonial attitude of the prophetic instruction even more. Perhaps Naaman should have believed in his own narrative. Abana and Fapa are the rivers near Damascus that water its oasis, which antiquity compared to paradise. Further questioning and probing are warranted for more Talanoa. What might have happened if Naaman had offered more resistance? What if the servants had shared the same pride in their rivers as Naaman? Now, to conclude, from a riverbank perspective, the question which Naaman poses out of his wrath needs to be considered more carefully because they reflect the sentiments of native and indigenous bodies and voices. To silence such voices is to be guilty of gaslighting and giving prominence to a narrative that marginalizes native characters. As we reflect on the significance of sacred waters in this meeting, we must first be aware of the colonial tendencies that threaten to destabilize native affinities, pushing us to seek transformation from foreign sources. This may not necessarily be a bad thing, but to silence native voices as a precursor to transformation can result in other changes that may not have been envisioned and may therefore prove to be detrimental. While the narrative does see Naaman healed of his leprosy, one must ask the question of whether the transformation was holistic. Physically, he was like a young boy after washing in the Jordan River, but what of his mental and psychological state? We may argue that in his physical healing, his mental state, in respect of his cultural well-being and nativeness, is compromised as he is converted to a foreign mindset and faith. In light of the silly resistance to the Samoan government plans for hydropower, there was room for talanoa between the government and the natives, and in the end, a resolution was reached. Perhaps there was space for Elisha to engage in dialogue and talanoa with Naaman about his sacred waters and whether the healing could have been conducted there as opposed to the River Jordan. Sadly, all we see is the noble savage giving way to the prophetic command, who in foreign waters not only washes away his leprosy, but also his nativeness. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I have to admit, Second Kings is one of my favorite books in the First Testament, and I will never read that story the same way again. That was fascinating. And in my rush to hear this, because I was so excited about your presentation, I did not even read your introduction. So if you all will allow me to follow that. Brian Kolia is a lecturer in Hebrew Bible at the Malua Theological College and an adjunct at Pilgrim Theological College and Whitley College of the University of Divinity, Melbourne, Australia. He is a PhD graduate from the University of Divinity. His dissertation deals with reading skepticism in the Book of Ecclesiastes from a diasporic Australian Samoan perspective. He has published a number of book chapters and journal articles and is the author of two books, Carrying Kohelet's Mayota under House, and Australian Samoan Diasporic Reading from SBL Press in 2024, and The Unsettling Theologies, Memory, Identity, and Place in 2024, which he co-edits with Professor Michael Mawson. Brian is also an ordained minister for the Congregational Christian Church Samoa, and more importantly, is a husband to Tenaria and a father to Elikai. So thank you so much for that presentation. The Power and Politics of Water, Riverine Rereading of Naaman's Cleansing in 2 Kings 5. I'll now introduce the Rabbi Dr. Ariel Mayse. Ariel Ibn Mayse joined the faculty of Stanford University in 2017 as an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, after previously serving as the director of Jewish Studies and visiting assistant professor of modern Jewish thought at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts, and a research fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies of the University of Michigan. Mayse holds a PhD in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and Rabbinic Ordination from Beit Midrash Harel in Israel. Mayse's research and teaching interests include Hasidism, the Kabbalah, and Jewish mysticism, comparative religious ethics and theology, ecology, and the environmental humanities, medieval Jewish thought, and the philosophy of Jewish law. He is the author of Speaking Infinities, God and Language and the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Ber of Metzrich, practice that, Philadelphia, University of Philadelphia Press in 2020. Laws of the Spirit, Ritual Mysticism, and the Commandments in Early Hasidism from Stanford Press in 2024. Hebrew Translation in Progress, and Hasidism Writings on Devotion, Community, and Life in the Modern World with Sam Baron Shonkoff from Brandeis in 2020. His next project, As a Deep River Rises, Judaism, Ecology, and Environmental Ethics, is under contract with Brandeis University Press, and he's currently working on a biography of the Baal Shem Tov for the Jewish Lives series from Yale University Press. And Rabbi Mayse is presenting the Headwaters of Theology, Reflections on Water and Jewish Law and Thought. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm just going to set a timer for myself. Yeah, apologies for all those Hebraic words in the introduction. I really appreciate the way that you did that. Thank you so much to the hosts, Charlie, for answering every question I've ever had, Elizabeth, to being such a wonderful colleague and fellow traveler, and to my wonderful co-panelists. I'm looking forward, and I've already, Brian, learned so much from you. Water, I think, might rightly be described as a dominant current of Jewish theology. It's a decisive subject explored across almost 3,000 years of literature. Water is a metaphor, it's a mythic image that roots and rests at the bedrock of Jewish thought. Water, in the case rain, is said by the Talmud to be one of the three things that rest in the hands of God alone, along with childbirth and resurrection. Water is life. It's the stuff of birth. It's the kiss of death. It's a power and a substance beyond the realm of human control and beyond our instrumentalization. Water, in fact, simply is in the book of Genesis. As we read, Aruach Elohim merachefet al panei hamayim, the Spirit of God flutters or floats above the water that is simply there. And while God divides between the waters above and below, creating those continents that are necessary for life, water is a stuff so ancient that it is almost pre-existent. Water, in fact, is so omnipresent that the sages of Israel read Jeremiah 17:13, Mikveh Yisrael Adonai kol ozvecha yevoshu. The hope of Israel is Adonai, is God. All those who forsake you will be shamed, as God is the pool of divinity. The word mikveh here can mean hope, but it can also mean a pool of water. It's the same word that's used in the opening chapter of Genesis. So God is the pool of divinity, and all those who abandon you will wither and dry up. Yavoshu, not in the sense of to become shamed, but in the sense of yavesh, to become dried out, and Elizabeth, as you put it just a moment ago, desiccated. Water is the key of life to a religious culture, as Ellen Davis demonstrated, born in the Near East, in a land defined by its ecological fragility and its dependence on water from the heavens rather than human irrigation. In what follows, I highlight four specific elements of Jewish thought centered on water in the hopes that these few remarks will uncover more than they cover. And now I'm sure in contradistinction to the other panelists and Brian already, I have a shamefully technologically unsavvy presentation, but I'm glad that you will, or hope that you will, bear with me. I'd like to begin by thinking about water as a metaphor, not as a poetic flourish, but in the sense of Lakoff and Johnson's metaphors that we live by, parts of those conceptual structures that govern or guide our experiences of the world. Torah in rabbinic texts is likened to water, and Revelation is described as a day of momentous heavenly rainfall. In fact, the rain day is said to be of even greater significance than Sinai. Put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it in just a moment. But why is the Torah said to be water? Well, it flows to lowly places, to the hearts of the humble that are rooted deeply in the ground. It parches the thirst of those who are thirsty for wisdom and connection. But if we turn to the Midrash, to the ancient rabbinic commentary on the Song of Songs, that love-soaked devotional text, the rabbis tell us that water and Torah share common properties. They give life. They descend from the heavens with a thunderous symphony, bringing purification to body and soul. And so, if we follow this metaphor, drop by drop, letter by letter, water and Torah build into a mighty sea of love and learning. Here, Torah is not to be understood as the 5 books of Moses. It's not meant to be understood as a particular text, but rather as a kind of endless sea of possibility and wisdom that is shaped across the generations by its interpreters. This beautiful metaphor, I think, is why Rav Masharshaya counseled his child to study next to a river, to notice those rushing waters and to be inspired by them. I'm not going to talk about the Silmarillion, but if we have any Tolkien fans in the house, you know. I think this metaphor is also why another ancient sage, Rav, comes to understand when he encounters a certain miracle worker whose prayers are effective in bringing about rain. He asks the miracle worker, like, what's your claim to fame? And the miracle worker says, oh, I'm a teacher. And he says, really, you're a teacher? That's it? And he says, yeah, I'm a teacher of children. I don't charge anyone tuition they can't afford to pay. I have what we'd call a sliding scale. But this is the part that I think is most important. Any child who is struggling, I have a pond full of fish. And when they get bored in the classroom, I take them outside, I show them this pond full of fish, and it calms them and it soothes them until they learn how to read. We won't look at it together, but this is an obvious conversation partner for T.S. Eliot's Burnt Norton from the Four Quartets, and the power of what happens when we gaze upon a body of water in which time, past, present, and future folds together. And perhaps in the digital version of this presentation, I can make available also a magnificent poem by the contemporary poet Clint Smith, which reflects on this as well. But I want to go back to this point that Rav has made here, or rather the person who is speaking to Rav, and Rav is coming to understand. I think one version of reading this would be, oh yeah, so I distract the student and eventually I'm able to pedagogically involve them such that they gain the skills that they need to be able to return to formal schooling. I think another way of reading this is that certain children learn to read differently, and certain children learn to read, and they learn to read from nature. So I think reading at the end of this is not reading a book necessarily, but learning how to read the world around them, learning how to become attentive to and sensitized to the voices that surround us, whether that's the fish here, the more than human kin, or that's the waters themselves, which ripple with a kind of divine wisdom. So the Torah as water isn't just a metaphor then, but it's actually a way of thinking that guides, and if you'll permit me, reflects our experience of the world. A second theme that I want to just note here is water as an element of reciprocity, of interconnectivity, of giving, and of mutual support. Here we should remember and recall the life-giving work of Miriam, the water prophetess of the Hebrew Bible, whose well kept the Israelites alive in the desert. She attained this water virtue, we're told by the rabbis, because she watched over her brother at the Nile, and because she shared with the people and led them in song at the sea. Echoing this need, early Jewish sources already give a very striking ritual grammar for how communities ought to respond in times of drought. The Torah, remember, water, but here the physical Torah, is brought out to the center of the city from the synagogue. It's placed on the ground, and all of the attendant individuals, the entire community, places upon their heads and upon the heads of the people next to them ashes. They unite in fasting, in introspection, and in prayer. And the communal dimensions of this sacred work ought not to escape us. Rather than jostling for scant resources or entering into a kind of conflict, we are taught by this ancient rabbinic source to unite ourselves toward a common aim of social and spiritual transformation. Here I recall the work by the marvelous scholar Kyle White, who has an essay about what he calls crisis epistemologies, mindsets that lead us into conflict and lead us into doubling down on the structures that have actually brought us to this point, versus what he calls epistemologies or mindsets of coordination, where we respond together to the same set of shifting circumstances, some of which may be very dire and acute, but rather than emphasizing a kind of narrative of scarcity, we emphasize the capacity for network building, for connection, for reciprocity, for mutuality, and obligation. Now, Jewish sources know that water can also be weaponized with disastrous results. We're told by an ancient source that more refugees died because resources were denied to them than died during the destruction of Jerusalem itself. In our day of refugees, in our day of multifactorial crises across the world, this is a powerful rejoinder against a kind of determining factor in which resources common to our shared life on this planet are wielded against other communities. And in my time remaining, I'd like to highlight two other elements. The first has to do with the rising waters that cannot be held in abeyance indefinitely. Interestingly enough, what we would call in our contemporary parlance geoengineering is actually discussed in Jewish sources from about 1500 years ago. One here, it's right in the center of your screen at this moment, links together the story of the Tower of Babel with the story of the flood, so chapter 6 and chapters 11 of the book of Genesis, respectively, and describes how the generation of the flood looked up and saw that there was a lot of water coming down. And so there are many possible responses. Theirs at this moment was, let's build something to hold them off. Let's build a kind of tower to hold up the heavens. They say this is the way of the world. There are cyclical climate structures, and we are going to be living through some turbulent times, but we can prevent catastrophe just by building a better technological infrastructure. One in the north, one in the south, one in the west, and the Tower of Babel, long that symbol of human hubris, will hold it up in the east. And of course, it doesn't work. The same is true of thinking about the flood. It's said in Jewish sources that Noah, in building the flood, had 100 years, perhaps even up to 120 years. And all during that time, he was castigating the people. They didn't want to hear it, but he continued to try to implore them to change their ways. And one of their responses is particularly interesting. They say, "Why are you building this ark?" And he says, "The Blessed Holy One is about to bring a flood." And they say, "A flood of what? No matter what, we got this covered. We have a fireproof box that we can all get into. And if it's a flood, we can put iron plates down. And if it's coming from the heavens, we can put up a giant sponge and we can absorb all the water." But we know that this is not true. We know how the story goes in the Hebrew Bible, but here the myth also echoes reality. Despite the capacities that we have as one of many technological beings upon this planet, we cannot stave off the results of our actions. We cannot hold at bay the waters that seek to flow, whether they are sent by God, as in the biblical imagination, or in the source that I'm highlighting right in the middle of your screen now. Almost, there we go. If you go back to the biblical story, you'll see that the opening of the heavens and the cascades of the waters are described entirely in the passive voice. And this source, by a 20th century Jewish thinker who I don't think had ever had any kind of, well, I know he didn't have any kind of ecological training, and I don't think particularly was interested in ecology, nonetheless points out something that is a really interesting element. And he says, why is God's name not mentioned in the story of the biblical flood? Because of all the different types of divine punishment, one of the worst is that which all children hate, the consequence, what in Hebrew we call a hashlacha. It's the moment in which God's hand is removed and human beings are forced to live with the consequences of their actions. And so the flood here is not a story of divine retribution, but a story in which human beings seek and fail to ward off the consequences of their own patterns of life. I'd like to close in this time by thinking about waters that shimmer. We talked about waters with power that is even terrifying, what the environmental philosopher Isabella Stengers would call the intrusion of Gaia. Here I use the word shimmer along the lines of the marvelous and much lamented anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, who uses a word from the Yolngu Aboriginal people in northern Australia, Biryun is the word, to describe the quality of a landscape or a natural phenomenon, although it's true of art as well, that is a kind of invitational and evocative power that vibrates across the world. So this is what she calls shimmering. And in Jewish mystical sources, God is described as an almighty ocean, an infinite pool, or a sacred reservoir of potential being, an artesian well of creativity from which all existence and all vitality that animates it flows. This is not a one-time thing, we are told, but an ever-unfolding story of God's radiant divinity. Here the mystical sources link together the word nahar, which means river, and nahara, which means nahora, which means fire or light. And so this light river, this ever-flowing fountain, waters the garden that is this world, nourishing the sacred tree of life, of which we are all the leaves on that tree, and the very real trees whose leaves whose leaves we find shade and comfort. This mythic river is beyond our command. But the mystics also tell us that our actions have a role to play in its health and in its stability. Our actions are never neutral. We either diminish this river and with it the capacities of our planet, or we work toward the collective flourishing made possible by those waters. Here again, we should recall that the communal dimension of this sacred work ought not to escape us, because rather than jostling for scant resources, we unite toward a common aim of social and spiritual transformation. I close with an ancient legend of King David, who drills down to establish the foundation of the temple in Jerusalem. He dug too deep, like the dwarves of Moria and Khazad-dûm. That's the second Tolkien reference. I don't know why it came to me. And in this case, rather than a Balrog, it's water that threatens the world. So what does David do? He writes out the name of God on a potsherd, the name of God that refers to God as the source of all existence, and he casts it into the abyss, causing the waters to subside. I take this to be a rabbinic reflection on how we can use tradition to address the problems caused by our being in the world, and especially by our kinds of extractivism. We take up that which is broken, that fragment of pottery, and reinscribe or reimagine our patterns of life, coming to see the waters as neither enemy nor as resource, but as the ultimate source of our lives. Only then do the waters subside back into that reservoir of infinite possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. One should never apologize for too many Tolkien references, Ariel. That was wonderful. Okay. And I will reiterate, I think Charlie's put this in the chat, but if those of you joining us, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section here, and we will attend to those after the presentations. That would be wonderful. Next, we have Dr. Stephen Lansing. And J. Stephen Lansing is an external professor at the Complexity Science Hub, Vienna, and the Santa Fe Institute, and an emeritus professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona. From 2015 to 2019, he was a founding director of the Complexity Institute and professor in the Asian School of Environment at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His research on Balinese water temples was the basis for Bali's UNESCO World Heritage Cultural Landscape in 2012. His 1991 book, Priests and Programmers, Technologies of Power and the Engineered Landscape of Bali, was the focus of an exhibition by a team of architects, artists, and researchers from the ETH Zurich at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial in 2019. His most recent book is Islands of Order, a guide to complexity modeling for the social sciences. That's from Princeton 2019. Presently, Dr. Lansing is working with the Leakey Foundation and the Nature Conservancy to assist hunter-gatherers in Borneo, and with Balinese colleagues to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from rice paddies. And his presentation is entitled A Letter to the Future from Bali's Subaks. Dr. Lansing, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. These were wonderful talks, and I've just realized that I've got my talk just in the wrong order. It's in reverse order. I spend my time trying to convince scientists at places like the Rice Institute or Planet, remote sensing people, in the end about the importance of metaphors and ideas about water. In this case, however, I'm giving you the talk I give those guys, which starts with the crisis that we're facing, the flood of methane going into our atmosphere. So let me begin my talk with, here we go. Right. Can you reassure me that you can see the observation, the observatory? Can you
Yes, we
see
can.
right? You
Yeah,
can. Okay.
perfect.
So that monologue, I'm speaking to you from Hawaii, and is it actually in just one more thing? Get this to play. Okay, here we go. So this is Johan Rockström. He's the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change, and we'll start with him.
The 21 years of negotiations, we adopted the legally binding Paris Agreement, all nations in the world keeping global warming under 2 degrees Celsius, aiming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Today, 3 years down the line, we're still in the hand-waving business.
So there's the Keeling curve, the curve of the CO2 levels at Mauna Loa from the beginning, from 1958. And as you may notice, it hasn't budged after all the years, all the Paris Accords, everything going on to try to bring this under control. We've gotten nowhere. So time is getting short, and we need to think about how we're going to keep those floods of methane and carbon dioxide from flooding into our atmosphere. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. From a Balinese perspective, in the end, you can see. So this is about the commons. Not long ago, the commons was just a tract of land or water owned or used jointly by the members of the community. But recently, Johan and other guys thinking about the global commons have said we need to redefine it to include the climate, the fresh water, the oceans, biodiversity, all the things that we depend upon, the planetary boundaries. In 2009, as you probably know, Lynn Ahlstrom got a Nobel Prize, the first time a woman got one, in economics for her work on studying how the climates can be governed, which in a sense is the problem of our age. And the citation said it was long unanimously held among economists that natural resources that were collectively used by their users would be overexploited and destroyed in the long term. That's the tragedy of the commons. But she disproved that by conducting field studies on how people manage their commons using techniques that work in small communities. The year that she got the prize, and shortly before her death, sadly, she posed a new question about the global commons. Simply this: will lessons from small-scale social dilemmas scale up to the global scale? Well, I begin by saying, actually, they already have. If you haven't heard about Nilometers, it's a wonderful story, because what they did for 47 centuries is enable communities along the Nile, to predict the climatic variation that would make it possible for them to plant their crops in such a way that they would be able to harvest them effectively. And it was part of the discovery of Benoit Mandelbrot about how chaotic circumstances can develop, and later how they can be tamed. So here's the annual flow of the Nile. It's been recorded for many centuries.
If we
Here's
want to
Benoit.
define the very notion of what the average level of Nile is, it almost goes through the fingers. There is no average level around which it fluctuates. You mean that dynasty or that dynasty, that period, that period. Therefore, the way of thinking which we are being used to, which Laplace around 1800 taught us very strongly of randomness as being fluctuations around the middle value, does not apply easily to the Nile.
Because, well, from one year to the next, the flow of the Nile is chaotic. Each year, after it reaches its maximum height at each Nilometer, then the recession of the Nile is very predictable. Theodorus, sorry, my computer's kind of not aligned properly, but anyway, you can read it for yourselves, right? All immediately know in advance about the next harvest because they've kept an accurate record of their observations for a long time, centuries. Flows were measured by Nilometers along the river. And once the water stops rising and reaches its maximum that year, then the communities can allocate the lands for their crops and begin to plant. The extraordinary thing about that is most of the dynasties allocated the taxes, they assessed taxes before the crops went into the ground, because the predictions of the Nilometers were so perfect, 47 centuries. They were placed along the length of the Nile from the first cataract to Alexandria, and they enabled the management of each of the local areas as a commons, right? Allocating who plants when and where. 47 centuries. In 30 BC, Augustus orders his army to repair the irrigation canals which had been neglected in the reign of Cleopatra. And 2,000 years later, Napoleon addressed the army of the Nile, telling them to do the same thing. Okay, so Nilometer technology lasted forever. Here is a commons, a global commons that made Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, right, for millennia. The Nilometer technology improved, but the goal, which is adapting to the climate that determines the flow of the Nile, remains unchanged. We now have climate technology. The most important one, I think, that just recently was launched is MethaneSat, which monitors global emissions of methane, which is roughly 28 times rather, more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But MethaneSat monitors major global emissions of methane. It does not trigger local adaptations. So we're still in the hand-waving business. Here's the anthropogenic, human-caused methane emissions by source. Consider rice, which is an enormous source of methane emissions. Roughly 9 to 10% of global emissions from rice also feed billions of people. So 70% of those emissions occur when the fields are flooded. Why are the fields flooded? Because in the past, algae in the flooded fields provided the fixation of nitrogen, which the crops used. Now farmers use chemical fertilizers for nitrogen, so flooding could be minimized. In 2018, we began to measure greenhouse gas emissions from Balinese paddies at parts per billion accuracy. This is our team. Replacing continuous flooding with adaptive irrigation, just adjusting the flow of water, as the Balinese farmers have done for centuries, reduced the methane emissions by 70%. And as an unexpected benefit, less fertilizer washes away from the fields if they're not flooded. Instead, it stays in the paddies and it's used by the plants to grow. So the rice yields went up by about 25%. Keeping the fertilizer in the fields also benefits the reefs, the coral reefs, because otherwise, it grows weeds or it flows into the coastal ocean. And the excess nitrogen fertilizer on the algae kills the coral. So isotopic analysis of the cores of dead coral, which we began in 2005, show the damage. How's my time? I've got 5 minutes more, maybe 10. Okay, so here's Dick Murphy looking at the reefs.
Massive colonies of tabular or table coral, these aquaporid table coral, some of them the diameter of this boat, and they're in perfect health. Whereas on the mainland, we also saw some pretty large corals, but most of the large ones were dead. And so that tells us that in the past, the conditions were such, the reef was healthy, and those big corals lived long enough to really grow to a substantial size. But they're not alive now. So something's changed.
So here's our paper in 2005 showing that the introduction of the Green Revolution commercial fertilizers, which is the curve going up to the right, tracks the introduction of the Green Revolution fertilizers, changing the composition of the corals and ultimately killing the corals on the coast. All of it kind of ironic. In other words, the farmers are being instructed to buy excess fertilizer that they don't need, and it's killing the coral.
Proyek ini bertujuan untuk satu, mengurangi penggunaan air irigasi, yang kedua, kita ingin mengurangi emisi karbon.
Namun sekarang dengan adanya proyek Demplot, kita bersama-sama, kami juga sebagai petani sangat-sangat merasakan.
Ternyata hasil kegiatan ini dilakukan oleh petani sangat baik. Mereka menghasilkan produksi yang meningkat lebih dari 20-30%.
Dari bekas saya Subak Beno, mengucapkan terima kasih banyak sudah membantu kegiatan-kegiatan yang ada di lapangan kami, sudah banyak mengurangi dana dari peserta kami dan hasil sangat melimpah sekali.
Dumun titiang boleh hasil sedurung ikut Demplot niko per 45 row niko boleh 28 pikul yang terapkan niko ring peserta Demplot sampun mungkin menghasilkan 3 ton 1 pikul 31 pikul.
perubahan yang ada di kegiatan kami yang diselenggarakan di subak kami ini banyak perubahan, terutama dalam pengairan kita ambil sedikit.
Di sisi lain, dari hasil riset bahwa penggunaan teknologi ini mampu mengurangi emisi karbon, khususnya metan, hingga 70%.
Seperti sekarang ini, kami petani bergerak menutun sendiri-sendiri, menganut sistem tua-tua kita, dengan sekarang adanya teknologi, dengan adanya perkembangan IT seperti sekarang ini, agar di subak benua ini, proyek yang semacam ini, kita bisa kontinuitas, kita bisa berlanjut, dengan harapan bersama-sama, ya kita mensejahterakan kehidupan petani.
Kami sewaktu Pakaseh mengucapkan terima kasih untuk ke depan bisa dilanjutkan tutup dengan Pramo Santi. Om Santi 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 Om.
There are inscriptions from 896 AD talking about the control of water irrigation tunnels being built by Balinese farmers. They're very good at managing water. What we've showed them here, and we are scientists, we're not policy people, but what we discovered is simply by changing the flow of water into the fields, allowing the fields to stay dry most of the time, you could reduce the methane emissions by more than 2/3. Nitrous oxide pretty much disappeared, and you're not flowing any further nitrogen fertilizer down into the coral. So since then, we've been attempting to make this work on a larger scale. In 2012, we created an NGO called Somya Prativi, the kindness of the earth goddess, to recognize the subaks as a UNESCO World Heritage. And now, some of the subaks, as this process begins, from the UNESCO World Heritage subaks, which you see on the right, are writing a letter to the future on copper plate in the style of the old royal inscriptions, which is modeled on something that was developed in Iceland just a few years ago when they were losing their first glacier. I'm just going to read it to you quickly. I'm nearly done. This letter to the future in Balinese and English says, "For centuries, subaks have grown rice to feed Bali's people." So this is by the way at the water temple. This is the subak addressing the world. "We know now that flooded paddies emit methane gas, which harms the earth climate. By shortening the time our fields are flooded, we can reduce methane emissions and limit the runoff of fertilizer that damages our coral reefs. We know what needs to be done. Only you will know if we succeeded." And the caption says, "Mangatis jagate," to cool the earth, because that is a ritual that this particular goddess, the goddess, earth goddess Prativi, is associated with cooling the earth, cooling the heart, just cooling, tis jagate. It's now April, and this ritual has just concluded at the Master Water Temple, the greatest of the water temples in the Crater Lake, near the center of the island in Mount Batur. And here we have 200 villages bringing offerings to celebrate the end of the year and the beginning of the next year. The offerings consist of the things that they have grown in their fields. This is the goddess of the lake, dwells in the lake, and everyone is bringing some tokens of what they've grown up to the Crater Lake to celebrate renewal. And here is the priest from that temple who was chosen by a trance medium as a child. And he's talking to people about why they do this. What's this about? As everybody comes with their offerings. So those two baskets, those large baskets, they say Pula, that's Bhagya Kriti or Pula Kriti. Pula Kriti means the origins of good things, of goodness, right? And what he's explaining is that the origins of goodness comes from what we collectively bring to give in token and recognition of our obligation to Trihita Karana, the relationship between spirit and nature and humanity. So this happens every year, and that's what I wind up telling the rice scientists or the remote sensing people. The reason this works, the reason it may be possible for Bali now to change the needle, perhaps that's our dream, right? To actually have an effect, a measurable effect on methane emissions, is because of this. Satellites are just a simple technological replacement for a nilometer. It's what the communities do with them that matters. And the interesting opportunity, we think, is that it becomes possible now to align the incentives for the farmers who want to grow more rice, and they'd also like to help the climate. They already perceive the problems with the climate and save the reefs. So their incentive is to reduce methane emissions. And then people who buy carbon credits for methane, which have been notoriously unsuccessful. Perhaps instead of having commercial companies selling carbon credits for prices to make money, basically, our Somya Pratiri NGO channels whatever comes in to the farmers from those incentives, right? From the global buyers that we hope will begin to materialize, so that they both are aligned in their need to control. By controlling water, they can play a measurable goal, we hope, a measurable role. I'm talking too fast, excuse me. Measurable effect on methane emissions. So that's my story. Many people are involved in this. It's we're finding we've just kind of waded into the carbon trading markets world. It is a strange world full of companies that are trying to make a profit, and we're just trying to kind of raise our heads and say, really, none of that is necessary. The satellites will enable us to tell whether a field is wet or dry. And that's all that's needed to be able to say, well, if it's dry, then the methane emissions have stopped. It makes just a few hours before that happens. And so you'll have these massive reductions in methane emissions because methane is 28% more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. Doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide, but clearly there's a moment now, maybe a decade we have, in which a sharp reduction in methane emission might give us a breathing space. All right, that's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lansing. That's fascinating work, and it just reinforces that idea that, you know, the integral ecology of all of this is so so important at this moment in time. So thank you for your work and your presentation.
Thank you for listening and watching.
Thank you. And again, for those of you joining us, if you have any questions, make sure to put those in the Q&A, and we'll have those here in just a little bit. We have two more presenters. First, we have Michelle Boyle. Michelle, let me check real quick. Were you able to get your screen? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I think we got it covered.
Okay. All right. Michelle Boyle is a transdisciplinary scholar and doctoral candidate in the East-West Psychology program here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She recently returned from a year as a guest researcher at the University of Torino in Italy, where her research centered on healing personal and intergenerational trauma through ancestral pilgrimage, investigating earth-based women's wisdom in northern Italy from the Paleolithic to the present. Michelle is a mother, grandmother, writer, and healer, and lives in Caddo and Wichita Territory in North Texas with her youngest child and her four-footed family. I like the way you put that. And her presentation is The Sacred Source, Culture and Spirit in the Valleys of the Po River Tributaries. So Michelle and Charlie.
Thank you, Sam. So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Michelle, and I would also like to thank Elizabeth and Charlie and Chantal and my co-panelist. I'm honored to be here with you. Hazel, will you be forwarding the slides, or am I going to do that?
That's me, Michelle. I'm controlling PowerPoint here.
Got it. Okay. Is that you, Sam?
Charlie, sorry. I know.
Charlie. Okay.
With the screen sharing, yeah.
Okay, thank you. By way of introduction to my project, I'm going to read an excerpt from a forthcoming article I have in Revision Journal, and then I'll go on and share with you some of the imagery and some of what I learned in a few of the hundreds of sites I visited last year, and then I'll close with reflections and directions for research. So the excerpt is Ancestral Waters. Next slide, please. On a hillside at the northern end of the Apennine Mountains in Italy, I helped my ancestor climb out of a grave with a wide marble capstone. As soon as she emerged, she grabbed my shovel and started digging furiously. making a mound of soft brown dirt so large it could not possibly have all come out of the grave. Satisfied and paying no heed to the dirt caking her velvet robes, she shoved the capstone open wider with the vigor of her years leading armies on horseback. Taking my hand, she guided me down through a dirt tunnel, descending at a steep diagonal for miles into the earth. Next. Eventually, we emerged in a massive underground cavern glowing with white rock and light. There were men and women everywhere, smiling and happily talking and singing, bathing and celebrating in pools around a massive artesian spring in the center. This, she said, was the source of their power. Upon waking, I came across a documentary explaining the geological history of the mountains my ancestor and I had traveled under in the dream. It began 250 million years ago with the Tethys, a sea so vast during the Mesozoic era that it stretched across what is now the Eurasian landmass. The Tethys, it turns out, was named for the Greek goddess of the sacred freshwater font at the center of the world. Wife of the ocean, she was identified with heaven as well, and mother to the world's springs, streams, fountains, and rivers. Her caves and caverns were mentioned repeatedly in ancient texts as the source for all of those waters. I visited caves, springs, and streams during fieldwork in Italy. My itinerary for those trips traced some of the remnants of the Tethys, which burble to the surface from far beneath the Apennines. Pilgrimage to these ancestral waters got me thinking about all the ways I have sourced and learned from water along the way. My awareness of the spiritual journey began 28 years ago with motherhood, bodywork, meditation, horses, land, water, and mountain lions. It led through madness, memories, and much love to healing, which in turn led to an integral academic path of graduate studies. Rooted in an ancestral healing project and conceived as a response to the collective ecological, spiritual, and social crises of the Anthropocene, my doctoral research has evolved into a terrapsychological and ethno-autobiographical inquiry into ancestral lands in northern Italy. Dream, synchronicity, ceremony, and ancestral guidance led to the site selection for my travels. Those sites and others pertain to my medieval and Renaissance ancestors, as well as both their ancient and prehistoric tribal predecessors. The sites and the ancestors I'm working with have been instrumental in my own journey through our collective transformation. Water has too, arriving at pivotal moments along the way. Like many, I've been drawn to water for healing, and I've often experienced that the consciousness of water flows from one place to a distant other, connecting rather than separating places in space and time. Though the concept of the memory of water is contested in Western literature, it is a central tenet of indigenous understanding of water. Katrina Walters of the Choctaw Nation, in her address to the 2014 International Indigenous Research Conference, emphasized that water transcends time and space, and in doing so connects us to ancestors past and future. Deborah McGregor elaborates with the Anishinaabe understanding that waters, as well as people, hold intergenerational trauma, and that waters themselves as sentient beings are in need of healing from historical traumas. She and Melissa Nelson point to the interrelational nature of original waterways and their fundamental importance to the health of ecosystems, both on the land and in individual humans. The damming and diversion of that natural flow through colonial projects has negatively impacted individual, regional, and planetary health. Notwithstanding those divisions and damage, Indigenous knowledge is resilient and gaining, perhaps in part due to our dire need of it, as well as the fierce and generous efforts of Indigenous scholars, ever-increasing influence in the Euro-Western Academy. Melissa Nelson states, the perception of water bodies as having a life force or spirit and being in some way alive appears to be universal among Indigenous peoples, and is also well established in the histories of European peoples who once met the criteria of being Indigenous. Perhaps it is this very memory of a tribal pre-modern heritage that underlies the disdain of contemporary water planners for animistic beliefs. Adherents of scientism and other isms can display a dissociative effect suggestive of the unhealed trauma present in the Western lineage, which continues to have violent impact on BIPOC communities and bodies. Resmaa Menakem makes clear how those of us of European descent have transferred and continue to transfer our unhealed intergenerational trauma onto bodies, communities, and lands we encounter, and says, white people must acknowledge their racialized trauma, move through clean pain, and grow up. As a white woman healing personal trauma, I am called to participate in the healing of Euro-Western intergenerational and collective trauma. And to do so, I seek the relational knowledge held in my bones and the lands and waters of my ancestors. The connection between water, body, and memory persists, despite the ruptures of colonialism. In my own ancestral healing pilgrimages on the Italian peninsula, I seek to understand the layers of colonial violence, Catholic, Roman, Kurgan, experienced by my ancestors there through direct somatic and ritual inquiry, to ask, as Dene Welsh scholar Lila June Johnston did in response to a ceremonial experience of her European indigenous ancestors, when and how did this egalitarian, earth-loving, woman-honoring culture become the colonial genocidal conquerors that washed upon American shores? Could it be that our beloved indigenous European ancestors were raped and tortured for so many thousands of years that they forgot who they were? Could it be that they lived in a pressure cooker of oppression for so long that conquer or be conquered is all they knew? I seek these answers in what is unsaid as much as what is said in textual histories. As importantly, I seek them in my own body, in ancestral lands, and in the water. Water's memory is indeed long. Much of the water we encounter on Earth is extraterrestrial in origin and older than the sun itself. Anishinaabe histories do not just include the time span of human history, but the time before, when, and pardon my pronunciation, when Nanabozo and other spirits walked the earth. Greek mythology, so foundational to the conscious arc of Western culture, speaks to that time as well, and Tethys is an expression of our cultural memory of it. While I was sunbathing to recharge during a break from writing, my ancestors urged me to remember that I was a child of the heavens and stars as much as of the earth and waters. Each of us, each being on the planet, is a unique expression of that meeting of heaven and earth. Manasarovar, a Himalayan lake at nearly 15,000 feet, is one such expression, and another remnant of the Tethys Sea. The combination of the depths of Manasarovar and the heights of Mount Kailash rising above it are a symbol of the union of Shiva and Shakti. It is, according to Sadhguru, a place that played a pivotal role in the spiritual evolution and most likely even the physical evolution of the human species. Priding himself on being the absolutely logical and straight-talking guru, he says, when I went to Manasarovar, for the first time, I saw things happening there that I never ever believed possible. Beneath the lake, there is a space where something beyond what we can logically imagine is happening, and this process is yet to be deciphered. It is a huge cavity with various kinds of life processes happening there. The waters in Manasarovar stem from the same source as the remnants of the Tethys in Italy. And as I prepared for 9.5 months there, I wondered what properties I would encounter, whether the meeting of divine feminine and masculine might be present in a resonant way, and what effect that might have on me. Next slide, please. And that's the end of the excerpt. That meeting, the inner alchemical work of conjunctio, did become a key theme in the pilgrimage. What happened first upon arrival in Torino was that I fell in love with the Po. I think, is that a video? The swans there on the right? Can you play it? Yeah. That was on the winter solstice in 2023. Next slide, please. This river where I had played at age 3 and that spoke to me in dreams before I ever returned to it as an adult became my spiritual home. I walked its banks daily, a practice shared, I found out, by my ancestor 1,000 years before, and one that became the core and anchor of the pilgrimage. That's Adelaide de Souza. Next slide, please. The Po mirrored, oh, there's a video to press play on. The Po mirrored for me what Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls the Rio Abajo Rio, her term for what she says Jung called the psychoid unconscious, a place where the biological and psychological worlds share headwaters, where biology and psychology might mingle with and influence one another. Throughout human memory, this place, call it the home of the mist beings, the crack between the worlds, is the place where visitations, miracles, imaginations, inspirations, and healings of all natures occur. Next slide. At times, she says, we are called to cleanse the river under the river, or the river of our own creative energies, of its pollution so a woman can regain access to her creative force. Before my first preliminary research trip, a dream took me to a specific place on the banks of the Po in Torino. In the dream, it was wild and lush and teeming with animal and plant life. When I got there in person, it was flowing in reverse and seemed half dead, banks covered in trash. I sat and prayed at the edge of the water for hours. 3 years later, after surmounting both some particularly arduous inner work and wild boar threshold guardians that lived in the park between my apartment and that beach, I arrived to find that a volunteer group had just finished a cleanup and were gathering dozens of black bags full of trash and piles of junk to haul away. When I sat to pray and sing this time on the now pristine shore, for a few moments the waters right in front of me changed direction and flowed the way they had in my dream. Next slide. On these daily forays into land, water, and liminal space, the currents, eddies, minerals, and animal life in the water drew me in, supporting expansion and access. At the same time, the river told the story of damage from mining, damming, agricultural pollution, invasive species brought by international trade, and flooding due to climate change, erratic snowfall, and melting glaciers. The Po in Torino lies at the confluence of millennia of human activity, and physically at the confluence of several tributaries. The Chisola, Sangone, Dora Riparia, Stura, and Dora Baltea rivers all reach the Po in or near the city proper. The Maira, Upper Po, and Foce Ticino river valleys taught me a lot as well. Next slide. The Sangone River sources near the small mountain town of Coatse, where my father carried me miles up the mountain on his back decades ago after a long bus ride from the city in search of a picnic spot. When my parents came to visit this year, I escorted them up the mountain this time in my trusty Peugeot to our picnic spot in the Coatse Park under the shadow of the Sacra San Michele Abbey. The ancient abbey, balanced atop Monte Pirciriano, sacred to the Celts among others, overlooks the Val di Susa, the gateway to Italy since Celtic, Roman, and prehistoric times. Interactions here between the Franks, Lombards, and the Church were foundational to Christian empire and Western culture. Next. On the same side of the valley, local archaeologist Roberta Crisara guided me to Presa dei Rossi, a prehistoric group of standing stones nearly identical to some in the Old Europe described by Maria Gimbutas as death, rebirth, womb temples. In the woods nearby were Bronze Age stoned fish and owls that Crisara believed functioned as signposts for territorial shaman guides who listened and spoke to the stones. She also showed me a medieval fresco in a tower below the abbey that may depict Adelaide and her mother Bertha, shown dancing holding hands, and their role in negotiating the investiture controversies between the Holy Roman Emperor and Pope Gregory. Next slide, please. In the valley below, the Dora Riparia carries silvery silt from mountain sources. Okay, no, there's no video here. Including the waterfalls that circle the paradise of the Val Cenischia, home to the ancient Novalesa Abbey. A nearby cliff holds the Grotta della Bom, prehistoric cult site shaped like a womb with its 2 horns, and now home to shrines to Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Christ side is bare. The Magdalene side is full of offerings bearing the names of children born, bringing them to the goddess. At the Abbey, there is a chapel frescoed with the Marys Magdalene and Egypt, where women pilgrims stopped as they were considered too unclean to enter the sanctuary itself. In both abbeys, a process of what the University of Pisa's Laura Galoppini calls the Christianization of the waters unfolded following the decline of the Roman Empire and the arrival of the Lombards and Franks. Like ancient indigenous traditions, this included a concept of water as life and vessel for spirit, and added layers of good and evil, sin, spirit, and flesh. Next. The Stura, reaching Torino and marsh near my dream beach, arrives from the Valle di Lanzo, home to the town of Canischio, which some claim to be the site of Adelaide's final home at the end of her life. She is known to have loved horse riding and hiking barefoot in the mountains there to a high rocky chapel. A bridge she had built graces the Stura to this day. Next. The Dora Baltea sources in the Aosta Valley from Mont Blanc and Il Cervino, the Italian name for the Matterhorn, among many others. My son and I took the waters in a healing spring under a prehistoric stone circle in Mont Blanc and danced with spirit dancers in the Cervinia Carnevale parade, which culminated in the giant and the white lady, an ancient pairing, arriving down the mountain slopes by ski and sled and torchlight. The Dora Baltea reaches the Po near Monteo da Po and the Roman site of Industria, a temple to Isis and Serapis, aligned to the Argo Navis constellation. Isis, legend has it, chose the site for Torino's founding because of the spiritual properties of the many rivers converging there. Next. The source of the Po itself lies high in the Western Alps at Pian del Re, the Valley of the King, under the shadow of Monviso, which is known as the King of Stone. I journeyed into the mountain itself from my home in Texas, guided by the ancestors to a spring shrine and a cave, where I met a wild Christ-like spirit of tortured lines of light, who carried me up through fissures in the mountain itself to the peak, where I was baptized by the sun under the eye of a dragon. When I finally arrived to the valley physically, I submerged my face in the source waters and drank, and communed with prehistoric ancestral spirits there through a scraper stone that guided me through a healing ritual. Next. The Upper Po and Upper Susa valleys, like the nearby Valli Varaita and Maira, are the Italian Occitanian valleys, home to long traditions of resistance and resilience. Adelaide's mother and father, Berta and Olderico Manfredi II, donated lands to abbeys here that became centers for learning and Occitan epic poetry and the troubadour tradition, an attempt to restore the balance between the masculine and feminine in European spirituality. There is a decades-old resurgence of Occitan culture and pride, showcased in the Valle Maira Centro per Studio Occitani, where I learned about the indigenous alpine traditions of shape-shifting and so much more, including the resurgence of the bear traditions dating back to the Neolithic and traditional wisdom passed through both music and lace making. In 2028, there will be a celebration of the millennium of this rich history. Next, please. At the Toce, flowing into Lago Maggiore and then continuing as the Ticino along the boundary between Piemonte and Lombardia, I spent a weekend in the town of Mergozzo, sleeping in a burial site dating back to the Neolithic and active through Celtic and Roman use, visiting a nearby proto-Christian church, and the quarry for the marble used in the Milan Cathedral, and walking paths in use for thousands of years in search of prehistoric stone buildings used in ritual. My host, a local archaeologist, who turned me loose for a self-guided tour of the locked Civic Museum, shared documentation with me proclaiming the locals' pride that they were the last Celts in the area to succumb to the Romans, and then by negotiation and mutual respect, not by force. A little to the west, in the Europa Valley above Biella, the Celts made pilgrimage to a dark fertility goddess in the form of a rock that was the site of women's ritual, syncretized now as the Black Madonna of Europa. Like in so many sites I've visited, the pilgrimage and devotion have never stopped since prehistoric times, though the trappings have changed. For today, I'm focusing on the Piemontese valleys I visited, but the petroglyphs in Val Camonica, a Venus site near Trento, a Neolithic shaman's hut above the Lago di Garda, and repeated trips to the Adige River and other sites in Verona, where my friend Claudia Farina, descended from Cathars, writes about the Cathar tradition and persecution in Lombardia. The second half of the year included a months-long road trip tracing ancestral pathways through the Czech Republic, Germany, Belgium, France, and England, as well as sites in Sardinia, Emilia-Romagna, Tuscany, Umbria, and in Rome. Connecting deeply with millennia-old traditions of the divine feminine resourced me to engage in much-needed healing of personal and intergenerational trauma around the masculine. And I drove through Mont Blanc and arrived back in Italy. After months away, a print on the wall in my hotel room confirmed that the bride and bridegroom had arrived. Next, please. One of my last stops was the Bagni San Filippo in the Val d'Orcia in Tuscany. Soaking for hours in this white sulfur hot spring waterfall in the middle of a forest was not only one of the most ecstatic experiences I've had, it offered visual confirmation of the work completed through the pilgrimage. These sacred source waters were, in the outer landscape representation of my interior landscape, no longer hidden underground. The confluence of earth, water, and stars had worked the same healing and initiatory magic on me that my ancestors had drawn on for millennia. I finished out the year with multiple invitations for collaboration and inviting paths for research, which continue to call my attention synchronistically. I will be following up on leads in the Occitan valleys as well as in central Italy. I hope to help facilitate healing river walks at the Po confluences inspired, with permission, by the ones done by Anishinaabe practitioners on Turtle Island. As I prepared this talk, many of the Po tributary valleys and the Po Valley itself experienced devastating flooding. And here at my home in Texas, the septic system leaked, and as it was being probed for repair, the irrigation system punctured and shot a geyser 20 feet into the air. The work goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. What a beautiful, amazing pilgrimage. My goodness, and what an ending. But I love. I've always been fascinated by the Black Madonna tradition as well as the Catholic tradition as well. So it always amazes me that the sacred there for millennia keeps being rediscovered and reinterpreted. So thank you for sharing that. I'm sure we'll have some great feedback there. And if any of you have or need clarification, please put those in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to those. So thank you, Michelle. And our last panelist today is Dr. Willis Jenkins. And Dr. Willis Jenkins is the John Allen Hollingsworth Professor of Ethics and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. He studies interactions of moral imagination with environmental change along several lines of inquiry. He explores how religion, variously understood, may matter for understanding environmental challenges. He's written 2 books on shifts in our Christian thought, in Christian thought, in response to ecological issues, and continues to follow developments in that tradition. He reads and writes about climate justice and ethics amidst extinction. In recent years, his research has arisen from projects integrating arts and humanities into multidisciplinary environmental change research, especially the Coastal Futures Conservatory, which he co-directs with Matthew Bertner for music and Karen McGlathry in environmental sciences. He is currently working on a book tentatively entitled After Humanity on post-humanist approaches to the study of religion, ethics, and environment. Dr. Jenkins is presenting on a presentation called Designing Research with Sacred Waters, Interdisciplinary Labs for Integrative Understandings.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And I just want to say I'm really grateful for these presentations. And if it's okay with you, I guess it has to be okay at this point, I'm going to work informally and colloquially and just offer a few examples, a few vignettes of the kinds of research that we're trying to put together here at UVA as a way of thinking differently with waters. So, I mean, just thinking about what we've heard already in this panel, I mean, if there's some common themes that are running through it, it's that at least that water is deeper than, other than, more than, excessive to the resource frame through which modern management typically approaches it, as it sometimes is made to appear in hydrology and environmental sciences. And one thing that scholars of culture broadly and religious studies scholars more specifically often bring is a sense that water is many. And we want to be able to create research that can hold the manyness of water without needing to reduce it. And so I'm just going to offer a few vignettes of our attempts to do that, to let waters engage our research, our human minds in a wider range in ways that yet retain science-based understanding of the wider systems in which waters flow. And so I'll be speaking informally here. Hopefully that's a nice bridge to the Q&A, and I'll attempt to be efficient. I don't have slides, but I will be flicking through some of these websites that that are related, web pages to these projects. I am not going to offer you full research reports. My intention here is to offer examples to think with for your own institutions and context. And the first one is something that began as what you see there, from the UVA's Environmental Institute, a Water Futures Initiative. And I've just highlighted, their initial idea of it being an initiative to work on solutions to major socio-environmental challenges and water security. And my involvement in this came about in the way that by offering a comment in the way that humanists often do. I said, well, why water security? Why that frame? That's a normative idea. Why not water justice or water sovereignty or something? I did the thing that humanists do, where we trouble the concepts that scientists may bring. And to her great credit, the director of the Water Futures Initiative said, well, okay, well, let's see what you can do. I'm going to pair you with a quantitative hydrologist, and I want you to develop a framework for thinking about water justice in a more pluralist way. Fair enough. I was taken more seriously there, and so with the quantitative hydrologist, Paolo Dodorico, I was sorry, I'm just losing my mind here for a second. I wanted to move the web page. Bear with me for 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna try this. Yeah, you can see that, yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so we developed this. This was like the initial web page for this, but for our project, what one with that title. Paolo Dodorico, he's from UCal Berkeley. He's a global expert on water security of a kind. He's really interested in water grabbing, the way that international water flows can contribute to distributional injustice, especially through food markets. He was interested in, he already came to this project interested in the ways that basically ways of thinking about water security in terms of the water needed for governance towards aggregate welfare in a typically market-based solution might create distributional unjust outcomes, especially where more powerful markets would be able to basically capture the water, especially through food production of less powerful communities and societies. So, in that context, I observed, well, there are cultural, religious values for thinking about water in other ways still, waters as sacred, and that shows up sometimes in social or political movements for the rights of waters, and maybe philosophical talk about the intrinsic value of waters. So we attempted to add a third domain of value, which we gathered under the category rights of waters. And so over a year of discussion with a team of researchers from law and engineering and environmental sciences and English and others, we worked to create a framework that would include those market-based values looking towards aggregate human welfare, commercial water rights, human rights to water to capture distributional justice, and then the values that we gathered under rights of water. And we eventually published this paper, Values-Based Scenarios of Water Security in Bioscience. And you can look at that later. For me, one of the most interesting things about this year-long project is that one thing that the hydrologists needed to know if they were going to incorporate the sacredness of waters, of rivers, for example, is what would be the environmental flow proxy required for respecting the sacredness of a river. In other words, does it have to be at 100% of its benchmark flow, or it's 40%? Is that okay? Should it be 80%? It's kind of a weird question for a humanist, and it might make you a little queasy that we're trying to be reductive, but I appreciate it as an ethicist. I appreciated the request to, okay, please tell us what are the material entailments of the value statement so that we can incorporate that into understanding of the system. The intent of this model, and I will skim down to this because I want you to see that to my great surprise, I've been involved in publishing papers that have equations like this. And so you get this great statement that says, you can express the relation of several different value systems. Just follow that kind of equation. I won't go into explaining exactly how we got to all there. You can read the paper and see it for yourself. What I want to convey is that what we were trying to, I guess what I understood my role to be is that among these engineers, economists, hydrologists, was we are not going to make an optimizing equation. So it's not an equation you can solve for to get the right water flow or the right water security. It was rather an attempt to build a model that works with quantitative material flows in order to enable deliberative pluralism over how to consider different uses of water within a system. And so that you could be able to see how much water would be allocated if you allocate this much environmental flow, maybe because the river is sacred, then how much water then is left for food production, and then how much water is left to for commercial uses, for aggregate human welfare, or you can run it the other way as well. I mean, the point again was, can we as a research team make a tool that allows people to think with different senses of water inside the same system in a way that then allows and supports ongoing iterative cultural reflection? So that's one example. Here's another one. This is the Coastal Conservatory. This is this project that we have at the UVA. Since 2017, we've been working to connect the sciences, humanities, and the arts towards a more integrative understandings of coastal change. This is a partnership with the Virginia Coast Reserve, which is a NSF long-term ecological research site. One of the things that we do is we take the data sets of the scientists there, these long-term data sets, and we will, working with computer music students, and we sonify the data sets so that you can listen to them. So you can literally listen to the science of, for example, a tidal gauge change over time. And then we use those sonifications in compositions that become the center of performances that will include scientific briefing as well as humanities reflection and community feedback, so that you get this multimodal way of connecting the sciences of coastal change with the communities attempting to make sense of it. I'm not going to attempt to play these here, but I just want you to see. You can go here, and if you have a chance, listen to this: the recording of an oyster reef underwater. It's one of the more extraordinary, just straight field recordings. And then we will eventually make those. Here's a good sonification. If you listen to one of the seagrass sonifications, you can hear a translation of a sense of the world's largest seagrass restoration project, which takes place off the coast of Virginia. And here worked with the scientists to give sonic expression to some of the most important data streams there, especially carbon and nitrogen, so that you get to actually hear over time this seagrass meadow pulsing with life. And when you listen to the sonification, you immediately get a sense of the aliveness of this meadow, and maybe the importance of the restoration. Then this is always presented with the background of the science, what it's expressing. And then later there's an album that we produced, which I can send the link to later, in which beautiful music is created for this, and this becomes then a basis for our festivals. We have an annual festival. Most recently, actually, I wanted to highlight this because just a couple months ago, we went to the Institute of Sacred Music and presented a concert and symposium at Yale. And what I loved about that is that they were kind enough to consider what we produce as sacred music, and not something that we had used before. But here, what I love about that is a sense that sacred music can be made with the sciences and with expressions of data and as interpretations of material relations under study. And it might include composers from, in this case, other species. The oysters themselves are part of the production in ways you can read about. So are inhuman flows, the water flows are themselves, especially through the tidal gauges. There's one of our compositions, the pattern of the tidal gauge dictates what the musicians will play, so that the tide is in effect playing the musicians. When we do this, I have been inspired by one thing that Robin Wall Kimmerer, well-known writer, of course, said when she was working at the another NSF long-term ecological site, the Andrews Forest in Oregon, where she's described its data archive as a sacred text, and described the need to find lessons on how we might live from that data. And I often think of what we do in the conservatory, creating music as from the data of this as a way of doing that. I just want to offer one more two more cool examples, and just a few more minutes. I'm just going to take like 3 or 4 more minutes. We at the University of Virginia just launched a Contemplative Sciences Center, and it has in it an immersive sound experience room designed by the Coastal Conservatory. So in this case, our model has it's been inscribed into one of these buildings. And what I especially love about it is that now these water relations and the science-based, humanities-informed, music-expressed set of connections is involved in how the university is thinking with the idea of the contemplative and how to work with it. We think of, or at least I will say I think of our work as contemplative in the sense that it is offering a way for it's an arts-based practice that opens a way for science-based understanding to work on our moral imaginations. Maybe that's one way of understanding the contemplative through these unusual arts of attentiveness. And then the last example I'm going to show you is here. This is related to that coastal work. There's a separate grant called the Eastern Shore Virginia Climate Equity Project. We'll see how long that lasts, with 2 scare words in the title of it. This work is basically attempting to facilitate community-centered understanding of coastal change and allow community members to direct the kinds of research that happens. One of the things that I've learned about is the effects of sea level rise and saltwater incursion. And as I listen to people tell their stories about this, one thing that strikes me is the way that waters of companionship, waters of kinship, have become difficult relations. So waters that families have created ways of life with for hundreds of years, generations and generations, and now become threatening in ways that the way they're experienced is in this creeping way of fresh water being less available, and especially of the failure of septic systems. And the failure of septic systems often happens along geographies of historic injustice, so that those living in low-lying communities are often those who have been historically excluded for years. And so one of the things we're working on now is a sonification of the distribution of those problems in relationship to precipitation surges and saltwater incursion, and it's happening along I get the computer musician is using a dance track for it, and we're hoping this will become the basis for a community conversation about relations that are difficult and that people may not want to talk about, but the music offers a kind of sideways way in, a different way of I think just engaging things that can be difficult and when in their received political frames. So I'm gonna stop there and just say that what we're trying to do here is experiment in ways that allow waters to flow through our disciplines and our divisions in ways that can render them more fluid, transform our ways of learning and sharing. So I'll stop there and look forward to conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Willis. It's amazing to me how there's such a connection between some of the strands, as you were saying, and I'm going to be quiet. We've got a number of great questions, but I just wanted to say that sound and water, to me, that there's something there too that I think it's so wonderful. And I taught environmental science for years here in South Carolina, just down the coast from you, for many years before joining CIS. And I wish I'd known about the conservatory sounds. There are some students who've gone off to do marine biology programs and that sort of thing. I need to send them that link. That's amazing. Thank you for that work. And I will give you all just a few questions. We've got a number of questions. I'm going to try to conflate a couple of these. Dr. Lansing, there are 2 that I think kind of flow together if you would be humorous with your wisdom here. There was a question about the global consciousness around agricultural changes in Bali's suvacs, like the global consciousness changes that they were pointing towards. Could you speak a little bit more, perhaps, to the theological and scriptural framing around this envisioning of the world in Balinese Hinduism? And I know this is a huge topic. Relatedly, how was that wonderful letter to the future crafted, and who was involved in the writing? So you can speak on whichever of those you'd like. But also, a similar question, people's beliefs about water and the environment more broadly, how have those beliefs shaped the norms and practices people have been implementing for the rice paddies? So a couple of ontological questions, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm delighted. Thank you. I have written several books on this, so I'll have to kind of condense the story. But maybe I can link it to Brian's talk, which I thought was wonderful. Years ago, I got into difficulties with the Asian Development Bank because they were rebuilding Balinese irrigation. And they did it by coming in with engineers and just basically making little maps of little areas, but not thinking about the whole. That was catastrophic failure. And so that's been remedied. Balinese put things back together again. But the pictures I showed of those 200 villages coming up to give thanks to the goddess of the lake and so forth, it remains the case that that's basically opaque to the people who make plans for engineering, for water control. They're even some Balinese, they see it in a different kind of technocratic framework, and so we don't grapple with it. I gave a talk. I was just saying to someone else, I gave a talk at Stanford School of Sustainability a little while ago, and which was wonderful. They're really interesting people, but the idea of connections, the notion of a global commons, of connections between those local systems of management and the rest of us, that still somehow there's some opacity there. We don't really think about, or with respect to just the last talk about the like multi-species ethnographies of places. So I was asked to review a book some years ago, a manuscript by someone who'd done anthropological fieldwork in a particular island, which I will not name, and wrote about the multi-species ethnography of that place. The problem is we'd recently done genetic research there, and there are slaves in that region, slaves, bought and sold, right? Some of them even put to death. So that apparently had somehow missed. The ethnographer, who clearly didn't speak much of the language, simply didn't see that. So you have kind of this tissue of ideas about, really Western ideas about the beauties of interspecies communication, but in fact, it's tragic. So I brought back to that place an old friend who's the head of science writing for Indonesia's main newspaper, Kompas, Arif Ahmad. And he came, and he was a little skeptical at first. He said, Steve, are you exaggerating? Are they really slaves? So I introduced him to some slaves. Occasionally they escape. And the result was a series of articles in Indonesia's main newspaper describing the condition of these people as slaves. And we hope that the result of that would be the appointment of Jaksa Agung, of special prosecutors. It didn't happen. So that problem remains. What I'm trying to say, there's a kind of an opacity with respect to looking at the local systems that we all too easily elide, right? We know that there's something there. Last COP28, I think, said most of the world's most important resources are managed by indigenous communities. They're the best managers of the forests and the waters and so forth, the jungles and the coastal regions. But therefore we should support them, right? But that somehow still sort of isn't happening. So with respect to the letter to the future, that came about. We had a group of Subak leaders for a stakeholder meeting. I won't go on too long about this, to describe what should we do to make their claims to managing the waters apparent to the gold standard Swiss company that decides who sells carbon credits. And I mentioned to them the example of the letter to the future, which the Icelanders had recently placed at the terminus of the first glacier that they think is going to be the end of it. And I thought, what do you think of this? And they said, okay, we can write that. And how should we do it? And there was further discussion. In the end, we decided, well, we'll write it in the style of the inscriptions that go back about 1,000 years and are still held in reverence in the villages, which are the letters from, in this case, from the Rajas to the people. We can write a letter. We Subaks can write a letter to say, how do we, this is what we're doing. Only you can judge our success. They like that idea very much. We've made some of them already in copper, and they will start to go up. So I'm sorry, that's kind of a rambling answer, but it's a very large topic. And my point is that the more that we can engage with local communities that are in fact the stewards of the lands, of the waters, who are often not, we ally them, we don't really engage as well we might. That's not colonial. I mean, that sometimes I'm criticized for being a colonialist because skin is the wrong color. It's not the same thing. I mean, if you're working with the people, learning from them, trying to bring your skills to bear on their problems, I think it's a very different kind of relationship. In fact, I know it's a very different kind of relationship. So I hope that may have touched in some way on the questions of interest to the questioner.
Thank you so much. And yeah, that's incredible topic, and I'm sure we could speak all day. But thank you for setting light on that. Charlie, do we have time for one more?
We do, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, let me see. This question was for Brian. Brian, given your diasporic Australian Samoan perspective, how might Indigenous or Pacific Islander understandings of sacred water reshape how we interpret biblical cleansing narratives? That's the question.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's quite a multivalent question.
Yeah, 4 minutes ago. No, sorry.
Yeah, I mean diasporic people from our part of the world, it's sort of part of our heritage here as Pacifica, because we do descend from navigators of the ocean, and so it's in our blood to migrate and to move to other lands and to navigate the ocean. So when you find a lot of us Samoans in particular living in Western societies, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, or the States, it's sort of our continued heritage as navigators that we continue to migrate. So the reason I say that is because as we migrate, we take our culture with us. We take our sense of identity and our native sensitivities as well. It does get affected, and sometimes it gets lost as we migrate. But we're grateful that we still have this connection to our homeland, which is probably whereas other peoples aren't so fortunate enough to have that connection with their homelands. But for us, Pacifica, we do, and we're grateful for that because it allows us to get rooted in culture as well as our native practices. So for myself, I'm a unique type of diasporic person where I've grown up in Australia, but then I've moved back to Samoa to live. And so while a lot of my education and the way I think has been shaped by that experience growing up in Australia, I've come back to Samoa and followed a lot of our native ways of knowledge and our native understandings of our spaces, in particular land and ocean and water. So in that sense, I'm probably at a more advantageous position than most diasporic Samoans who don't have that sort of setting. And so I don't speak for all of diasporic Samoans, but I speak for my particular case, where coming back to Samoa has been an experience where I've been able to not just engage in culture, but also observe how my people, and a lot of this resonates with Dr. Lansing's experience with the Balinese people, how they are stewards to the ocean and to the waters, and a lot of it comes through a lot of that knowledge you'll see comes from is maintained through these native stories that we hold. And while people might classify them as myths in one sense, there's a lot of truth to these myths, and these myths they sort of manifest our the way we feel towards our natural resources, and the way we protect and the way we take care of the land and water. So, you know, and that's where the resilience is built from, and the resilience to withstand pressure from governments to utilize our resources in ways that might seem beneficial in some ways, but in the overall picture and the holistic view might be actually detrimental, not just for our local village, but also neighboring villages who actually benefit from these natural resources. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm trying to put it in a small package.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. That's a wonderful answer. And for those of you who send in questions, I'll send these out to the group or to Charlie, and we can see if we can collate these. But we do have some amazing questions, and each panelist got a couple, so I wanted to make sure that everyone was able to get that. But I will wrap up quickly here and say thank you all to each of our panelists for the rich and moving insights that you've shared today, for drawing us deeper into, I lost my script, sorry, for drawing us deeper into the currents where story, ritual, ecology, and justice meet. What we've encountered in this conversation is not merely scholarship or critique, but a form of sacred listening to rivers and laws, to ancestors and tributaries, to rituals and futures still unfolding. And as we close, I do want to acknowledge a poignant moment that shadows and sanctifies our gathering with the death of Pope Francis and his encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home has been a lodestar for many of us during doing this work, at the intersection of religion and ecology. In it, Francis calls us to recover the grammar of simplicity and communion, to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and to recognize water not as a commodity, but as a basic and universal human right, and as a sacramental thread in the tapestry of creation. Today's panel echoes that vision, whether through the poetic resistance of river texts, the mystical ethics of headwaters, the ancestral flows of northern Italy, or the systematic wisdom of Balinese subaks and interdisciplinary labs and music. What we've witnessed is the possibility of water consciousness as more than metaphor. It is a spiritual discipline, I feel. It is an ecological imagination, and it is ultimately a moral imperative. So in the spirit of Laudato Si and in the memory of Pope Francis's prophetic voice, may we leave this space with a deeper reverence for the waters that carry us, a renewed commitment to listening across traditions and disciplines and time, and a sense of sacred responsibility, not just to speak on behalf of water, but to listen, to learn, and to live accordingly. So thank you to Charlie, thank you to Elizabeth, and thank you to all of those who work so hard to provide this meaningful experience at CIS. Thank you all for joining us today, and I pray that you carry with you something meaningful from our time together.